Hey, welcome to Beer and Philosophy. I'm back again with my friend Yoonseo, and he's going to talk to us today about his idea of the ladder of abstraction.
That's right. So the ladder of abstraction is a mental model. It's a general mental model that you can use to kind of interpret and manage all your information. For me, I've used it to interpret all my knowledge, and it's been very practical for organizing it and making sense of what really matters. And there's a couple concepts like when you look at a video, it's not. There's of course the general idea you take out of the video, but inside a video, there's like every word, every phrase that's said has some marginal value that it's providing, and being able to distill those ideas from each word and phrase and plug it into your ladder of abstraction can be quite powerful because it helps you understand which discrete pieces of information has the most value, and then you can be working with the highest value information in your mind. But anyway, first I guess we have to start off with what is the ladder of abstraction, right?
Sure.
So it's a mental model where it's visually speaking. Higher up, you have abstract ideas, right? Like information, or soft and hard, or slow or fast, far or near, right? So like there's so much. And then on the medium lower level, you can have ideas. Medium level like transportation, right? Lower level, you might get into something like, let's say, a truck. And then even lower level might be a particular brand of truck, particular model of truck, and so on, until you get to a very, very concrete where it's a particular branded model of a truck that's currently parked at a certain location in the real world, right? So when it goes all the way to the bottom, it touches actually the real world. So that's the immensity here of the ladder of abstraction. And yeah, that's.
Are you a Neoplatonist or something? Is this like a Platonic
I don't
world
know
of
what that
ideas?
means.
No, okay. Plato in the cave? No.
Oh, I see. Maybe.
Yeah, there you go. Right? Yeah, the world of ideas, right? But okay, cool. So you've given a bit of an example with the kind of like transportation dimension of this ladder of abstraction, from like the actual instantiated version of the truck all the way up to an idea like something far away or whatever.
Okay. Sure.
Right? No, I think you just did, right? So there's one example, right? Where
Yes.
It's like it goes from the idea of like maybe like space, like what is space, and like this sort of thing, and like distance and like stuff from that level. And so those are maybe somewhere up here. And then you talk about like the idea of transportation, like moving a human from one point to another point. And then we talk about like, well, how are we going to do that? One thing is like automobiles, and then under that is like trucks, and then under that is like brands and whatever, and so on.
That's
to
right.
get down
That's
to
right. Yes.
cool. So what's the way you mentioned before about this thing of like you can parse out an individual sentence word by word and layer that onto this ladder of abstraction. So maybe an example of that.
So suppose you're starting a conversation with a friend, and your friend says, "Hey," right? And so that's a greeting. It's a greeting, right?
Yeah.
And you've already pre-categorized. You're very familiar with greetings, the idea of a greeting, and you know that it actually doesn't provide much like informational value. The value it provides is in their signaling of friendliness. Signal is a high level concept, right? And so it's really, and it's also about attention, right? Attention. So you've already pre-connected the idea of a greeting with the high level concepts of friendliness and attention grabbing, right? So you already know what that's supposed to do, and you know that the greeting itself is kind of like it's low value from like from an intense informational perspective, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And then they may follow up with a phrase like, "Hey, look what I got here. Look what I've got here." All right. So again, another general statement that's very commonly used, and so you plug that into. Got it. I don't need to like memorize this phrase. Look what I have here. I don't need to memorize the greeting. Hey, right? You're very familiar with the idea underneath it, right? The underlying idea. That's a huge part of being able to use this ladder abstraction effectively. Looking at the underlying idea, and then you're just like, oh, sure, I'm just gonna come and look at it, and then what's an example something more interesting, something more unique, something more valuable. Right.
Yeah, right. So this is a very simple example. Now, I'd like to point out that there's a number of different things where, so one is there's nuance about the tone of voice, the facial expression, other nonverbal communication elements that go into. So it's like I can be like, hey, like there's lots of different ways of expressing that, and all those matter. And that is actually feeding a lot of information there that I might not pick up on. So just I wanted to point that out to make sure that we're not glossing over those elements.
Yep.
Too.
Insightfully noted.
Cool. And so it's like even though something simple is like, hey, look at this, look what I have here, or whatever it was, your sentence. There's a lot of background, secondary information embedded in that, which could have a great deal of significance. Usually it doesn't, and sometimes it does, right? So sometimes it's like, there's actually someone hiding behind the door with a gun, and it was like, hey, look what I have here. It's like one in a million or whatever. It's like very rare that something like that's happening, but sometimes it really, really matters, right? So that's important. And so we want to calibrate this like ladder of abstraction to pinpoint salient details like that, I guess. The other thing that occurs to me is that you can't instantiate, but you can't like articulate every possible data points on this ladder of abstraction. Meaning, so you said greetings, whatever. Like that's common enough, but like there's so many possibilities that it's got to be a little bit abstract and fuzzy. I'd imagine to like in the moment you could maybe think, okay, you've got this like framework and you kind of like apply it to the framework, but you can't like map out every possible combination of these things.
That's right. So I would say what's important is, of course, you can't map everything out before it happens. So it's more like understanding. It's almost like you create like these logical spaces inside this visual ladder, using very general ideas like, let's say, quick or slow, or what's another one? Direct or indirect. That's one. That's a high level one. And there's so much, but using those general ideas, you create a whole list of what I would call spectrum and point ideas, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea behind spectrum ideas is like point ideas are like energy, right? So it's like energy, you have a certain amount of it, it's a static value, right? For example, the amount of charge you have left in a battery, right? So that's a point idea, whereas the spectrum idea is more like a range that you can define. And sometimes, and usually this range is like a smooth range where you can be at any position within. And
but sometimes not. So like for example, so when you mentioned energy,
yes.
First of all, to my mind, energy is a bit of a spectrum thing. Like I'm picturing things like electromagnetic spectrum.
Oh yes, that's right. So it's like
and
often they have like these ideas have pairs where the electromagnetic spectrum is a spectrum idea because it has those frequency and bandwidth ranges, whereas energy itself, viewed from that simple idea, might just be a point. So definitely there's these pairs where you have common ideas that kind of like common fuzzy ideas that kind of diverge into points and spectrums.
Right, okay, that makes sense. And they're often paired, like in terms of, so you mentioned like how much charge is left in my battery. That is a particular, like is a point datum of a spectrum of like how much charge could the battery hold.
By spectrum, I mean like more so about like there being a negative value. So more so like hot or cold.
Okay.
Right.
So so it's a range in terms of like things are hotter or colder than other things, and there's not necessarily a like an absolute hot or cold. I mean, there is.
Yeah, I mean there is in terms of Kelvin, right? Yes, sure. Exactly. But like how we generally use it, it's I guess you could say that the battery charge is high or low, right? But like the high or low of a battery charge, it's like that's still kind of like an indirect idea that's on top of. It's a from 0 point, and of course from Kelvin, from even temperature, when viewed from that scientific perspective, it's up from absolute zero, but in practice it's usually just hot or cold relative to the human experience.
Gotcha.
So yeah.
Okay. One other thought that occurred to me when you talked about spectra usually being a smooth transition was that, say, like the electromagnetic radiation released from an electron in an atom is discrete, right? So like because it drops an energy shell, and so
the discrete energy levels, right?
Yes, yeah. There's no room in between. So it's still a spectrum because there's like the different levels of the shells, but it's not. It's discrete, right? It's like a step up. Yeah, that's right.
So even in deep science, sometimes you don't get that smoothness that you would expect.
Right. Well, in fact, I mean, I'm no quantum physicist, but it seems like at that scale, nothing seems to be smooth with very few things. So,
I guess at the same time, it's important to note that smoothness is a idea behind scale, right? So each step on a smoothness scale, actually, I guess here is where we could talk about. I mean, it extends to the idea difference between digital and analog, which is another idea pair on this ladder. But yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so now way back you were mentioning you did the like, hey, look what I have here, and then you were like, let's do a more complex example so that the value of it becomes clear.
That's right. Let's look at. I mean, I think there's two ideas that are really helpful, and it's the idea, and it comes out from this grand idea of total life impact. Right now, we're getting really practical. So what is the total life impact of a discrete piece of information, right? Okay. So if I told you that 1 light year is X number of miles, right, or X number of kilometers, it's like, okay, you got that, but how many times are you going to actually use that throughout the rest of your life, right?
Yeah.
So
aside from winning some trivia things here and there, probably not that relevant.
Exactly. Yeah. Unless you are in that field, right? Exactly. So that's total life impact, and then under total life impact, there's the idea of active impact and like passive impact, where passive impact is like more emotional. So it's like, and this passive impact and being more emotional is connected to like, does it make you feel good, right? Is it entertaining? Does it make you feel happy? Whereas active impact is more like, does it help you get something done, right?
Okay. Okay.
Done properly, done worthwhile. Yeah. And that relates into how I'm going to present, I guess, the more complex example. We have to mull on this, but right now I'm thinking like you're looking at let's say you're looking at a lecture, right? And then so it's like let's say it's like a 2-hour video, right? And it's like they do the greetings, hello, I'm Professor da 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 da, skip. Right. You're already very familiar with those concepts. Right. You don't care about the friendliness. You're here to learn, right? You're here to learn things that you don't know yet, right? New things. So it's like, okay, got it, and then you accept that. All right, other people may have a good time with that introduction, right? Because sometimes it can be very funny, right? So there may be entertaining skits or whatnot, and so it's a matter of how much you value that passive impact versus the active impact of going for the more intensive. Right. So you've just saved like 10 minutes, right? And now you're into the gritty stuff, and then inside the gritty stuff, there's usually like a fluctuation between high level and like low level ideas. So by paying closer attention to every word and every phrase, you can kind of you can mentally allocate your focus to the parts that are more important. So that if there are, for example, transition phrases, right? And now we're going to cover X, or now that we've covered this, the next chapter is going to be more easy, right? So like that kind of transition sentence, the only idea it's going to give you is the fact that the next idea is in the right order of learning for the right learning curve in terms of the previous idea is going to help you understand the next idea, but you're so familiar with that, and that's also like an idea that's so basic that you assume that's how the content is going to be presented, right, that you can also not pay, like skip over that and like not pay too much attention to that. So you see how you can like focus on the most important parts, the actual information. Like let's say we're talking about the comparison of okay, how about let's say we're talking about encryption, decryption, but then there's encoding and decoding, and then there's hashing, all these software-oriented terms, and you're paying close attention. But I find that it's really important for you to here's another key concept: terminology, right? So terminology is the practice of distilling complex ideas into single words or short phrases, right? And if you can do that, you can kind of like take your detailed understanding of it and cram it into like a little small compartment in your mind, right? That's just triggered by a single word, and that actually lends us to another key concept in this whole thing, which is memory triggers, right? Yeah. Memory triggers, where terminology is still nice because it allows your mind to build memory triggers that take this cluster of chaotic information, which defines your understanding of a subject, and label it with something that you can more succinctly touch in your mind, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So this brings up a couple of thoughts. So I think in psychology they might call this idea like chunking, at least somewhat, right? So it's related, and it's like remembering a string of digits. It's easier if you chunk them into 4 digits at a time. Your brain remembers that as a single item rather than you might have like 7 plus or minus 2 slots in your working memory. So this this is important, right? So the terminology allows you to condense a whole wide array of things into kind of one chunk from that perspective. So that's pretty cool.
And I find that a lot of people may underestimate how much deep knowledge can be accumulated under seemingly simple concepts, like for example energy versus power, right? Like there's so much that can be underneath that in terms of understanding, and I think in practice when you're looking at like even any experience, right? Like it doesn't have to be actually an educational video. It can be even looking at a movie, right? When you're looking at a movie, it's like you can be extracting like, okay, how is this social interaction happening? Like what are the sentences used to close the conversation or kind of shift the topic of the conversation? Like you can be, and now here's actually 2 huge concepts: logical induction and logical deduction, right? So on this ladder of abstraction, you can take a specific example and derive a general pattern out of that, and that's logical induction. And then you can take a general pattern, like gravity across the world, and say it's going to be happening here too, and that's of course logical deduction. So general patterns, taking that into a specific instance is deduction. A specific instance into a general pattern, that's the induction. And now I had another related topic here, but these 2 are actually cornerstones of being able to build a this personal ladder abstraction in your mind, I would say.
Okay, interesting. I mean, perhaps we have different definitions of deduction versus induction, so that might be the fodder for the video there. But so certainly this idea of distilling down or expanding out, I think that's a really valuable concept there, right? And so there's a lot of these. Now, one thing that occurs to me is your ladder of abstraction versus mine. We may place things on different levels. So something like direct, indirect, or near versus far, or power versus energy. We're talking about, right? So like those, we may kind of like place those differently. So that's an interesting point as well. Anyways, there's just something that occurred to me. Okay, cool. So I think I can see how so really let's see. So just having this framework, do you think that most people do not operate with this in the background?
It's tough to say because I don't know how other people think, right? Okay, people think in such different ways, right? It's interesting, but I guess not so much.
Right. So you think generally people, because one of the ways that we as humans learn is by making connections with things we already know. That's right. So that's why that that idea of the terminology can be so powerful, because it allows a single word to convey a whole tree of knowledge that's all kind of attached to that single point.
That's right.
And now, of course, there's transmission problems of maybe, like we just experienced perhaps there with deduction might mean slightly different thing to you than me. So that can cause a bit of a, miscommunication there potentially. But there's such huge value in that idea of transmitting a whole huge concept or spectrum of concepts with a single word. The other thing that's of interest to me is you're talking about watching, say, a lecture or a video, educational video on something, and skipping certain, or maybe just like toning down your attention for certain periods of time because you're like, oh yeah, I get this or whatever. And so I think that makes a lot of sense, and so it saves kind of cognitive effort there, or perhaps that's the time when you like just switch and do something else briefly that you're working on.
Or you reflect on like a previous concept that was more intense that was covered. And I would say there's some practical notes I would put up. I would say when you're like being careful when you're interpreting any experience with this kind of like intense mental model in place, you want to ask yourself the questions: what's the idea, right? What's the idea, right? So often information streams, whether you're watching a video, reading a book, or in a conversation, information streams are going to be ideas with examples, ideas and examples. And if you can identify what is the idea, and when you shift to an example and deriving the nuances from that example, right, you can understand that information stream with a lot more clarity. Right. Because there's like a core concept within the example. There's supporting concepts that you attach onto the core idea, and it's this actually general action that you really want to pay attention to. Because sometimes when you're in a conversation, the ideas are flying off everywhere, and you might find yourself overwhelmed to try to organize it. But the simple questioning of what is the core idea, and then let's try to ground it in an example, and through that example, what nuances do we also uncover, right? That's important.
Okay, cool. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a huge idea, which is what I would say, what I would call a complete learning sequence that builds on this model extremely powerfully, and it has to do with the general process of how we learn something that leads to actual results. Right? Okay. So here we go. So we start off with concepts and their interactions, right? Then we go on to details and their calculations, right? Then we go to tools and the skills to use them. And then there's practice, so we can train under time pressure, develop good habits, and solve unique situations. And finally, real action, so application, right? Which brings us two unique things that practice doesn't give us, which is number one, the psychology of high stakes, right? High stakes consequences. And number two, the challenge of uncertain, unexpected factors, which usually practice takes out. Practice is usually in a vacuum, right? The real world, all gloves are off, right?
Right. Good point. Right. So ideally, we want to make our practice look as close to reality as possible.
Practice realism.
But oftentimes the constraints of safety don't allow for that. And so, say for example, I've never done this, but say like what do they call? Is it called paper trading? When you like pretend you're trading stocks?
Yes.
And then so of course, if you actually have like all your life savings on the line, the psychological pressure would be hugely different. And so even though you practiced and it was like it's very real world that but the emotionally it wasn't anywhere close, and so that makes a huge difference. So there's like an example of that disconnect.
That's right.
Whereas say in self-defense training, we try and make the training environment as closely mirror the both emotional and physical reality as possible. But even there, like on a certain level, this is my friend that we're training with. It's not reality. The knife isn't really sharp, and like all that sort of stuff.
The stakes are lower, and it's like I think a very compelling difference is you're in the mindset of training, and you're in the mindset of self-defense. Whereas in the real world, dangers pop up at you just unexpectedly. You're thinking about something entirely different, and suddenly it's like, what the heck's happening, right?
Right.
So panic mode is really challenging.
So we can accomplish that to some degree, where like we say do 10 scenarios, and 9 of them involve no violence or surprise attack, and then one of them does.
So we can actually try to accommodate those.
But on a meta level, I'm training right now, so there at some point is going to happen, and so it's definitely different. Okay, cool. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. I really like that idea, and so I almost feel like we should like write out and have in the description those different levels, like you just said, the tools and application and practice and all that stuff. Or actually, is this on your website? Maybe now's a good time
we
can put that link in the description. I'll be more succinct. So this will be linked to your website. We can put that in the description box down below if you want to check that out. Okay, cool. And I assume you have more info and detail on these things. Okay, cool. So if you're interested in that, we can check out the link in the description. So a couple other thoughts I had to just wrap up this, perhaps. So one is, it's interesting because we know that for learning, you need to connect things to other things, right? Yep. So sometimes that idea of actually like preview, actual information or practice or whatever, and then review, that really helps solidify things, and particularly if we're changing between topics, to actually have that linking sentence of like, oh, okay, like, so we've just talked about X, now we're going to move on to talk about Y. That actually can be helpful in solidifying that connection in our brains between those two concepts.
That is very true.
And however, there's a judgment call in this where, you might be like, yes, I know that this concept relates to this because I've got a deep, mastery of these related topics. And so therefore you can, shift your attention away during that particular, sentence or transition moment. Whereas for someone who doesn't have that rich connections, they may benefit by actually
hearing it out and like just absorbing it, right? Absorbing that connection so that their mind can organize it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So interestingly, then so as one tidbit, and then ironically, I'm going to mention the idea that so you were talking about this ladder of abstraction allows us to take the kind of rambling, perhaps disparate concepts, and kind of assign them in our minds. Like, okay, here's a high level concept, here's an example, here's a path of application, and like arrange all that. Because it would be nice if people spoke in like a university thesis, like a paper, format where they give you, here's my thesis, these are my supporting points, here's my conclusion. But people don't talk like that. A natural conversation.
Although concise
here. Yes. Right. Well, it's a hallmark of good writing. Unless your professor gives you a like must be 8 pages, right? Yes. It's like so frustrating, right? So yes, I mean brevity, I think, is generally speaking a positive trait. Though of course, can sometimes brevity
is good.
Yeah, well played. Okay, cool. So I really like this concept of the ladder of abstraction, and my intuition, my suspicion is that most people do not think as clearly in this hierarchical, structured way, and I think there is benefit to doing it. Now, actually, one question might be like, how often do you find yourself doing this? In other words, like, it seems like it would take a fair amount of like kind of active effort to do, at least initially. Over time, do you find that it kind of happens as a process in the background? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Nice. So it's sort of like, it's a little a process that can be running in the background, and you just kind of filter everything.
It's like you're building the infrastructure in your mind. It's a mental infrastructure.
Nice. Okay, cool. So that pays huge dividends down the road in terms of actively processing everything you're taking in. It sort of turns it into a bit more of a passive process.
Yes.
Which is obviously like time savings and like just saving that mental bandwidth for things that matter more.
And just that idea of the fact that you can put some time and effort into building something in your mind that will yield you a value continuously throughout the rest of your life. Yeah. That's immense.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
Immense.
Yeah. So I'm reminded of things like people have these like memory palaces, like things like that. So there's kind of one example. It's limited in a certain way. Like your thing has, I think, much more broad applications than that. But there's like an example of something that people like legitimately do, and they create these things that serve as, I can never pronounce that word, mnemonic. It's like an M and an N. It's like, how do you pronounce that? I don't know. But yeah, mnemonic device. Anyway, okay, cool. So as a final idea on this ladder of abstraction, one of the spectra perhaps we can talk about is alcoholism versus non-alcoholism. So if we compare our just like to point out that I think one of us is drinking a little more swiftly than the other. But don't draw any stark distinctions based on that. But
don't drink and drive.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yoonseo will be driving later, so we got to preserve his blood alcohol level.
Yes.
All right, cool. Cheers, folks.